We're going to get started now with our roundtable. This is held in collaboration with the LIVERAIM consortium, a European consortium creating a digital platform. It's a 5-year project, creating a digital platform for testing across liver diseases. The roundtable is called a deep dive into steatotic liver disease policy and regulatory processes. So we'll be covering both regulatory and policy issues. So I'd like to invite the panelists up to the stage and introduce my co-chair, Veronica Miller. So, we need to remember that we're not operating in a vacuum. And as I said in yesterday's opening, we need to consider the issues around the UN high-level meeting, a meeting that will focus on NCDs and how our work can contribute to that, how we can work to better collaboration across all NCDs, as we've been hearing sort of over and over. So right now, and I'll go through this rather quickly because we discussed it, but the background and policy is that to date, chronic liver disease, including MASLD MASH, is not part of the NCD agenda, and it's not a part of the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that just makes it harder to make policy changes. And when we do have good policies, it also makes it harder to implement them. The regulatory path for full approval of new MASH therapeutics presents several challenges that we're going to be discussing. So accelerated approval in the US and conditional approval in the EU are still dependent on the liver biopsy. There's a lack of alignment between the FDA and the EMA on requirements for accelerated approval. There's a need for long-term clinical benefits studies, qualification, validation, or acceptance of non-invasive biomarkers, trial inclusion, and for assessing outcomes in progress is another issue that's unresolved. There's a ongoing need for collaboration across industry, pharmaceutical companies, diagnostics, academia, a need for having a global regulatory harmonization. There's a lot of movements in different parts of the world, and it's not very well coordinated. And so recognizing the challenges in drug and diagnostic approvals and gaps in policies to ensure access to screening, diagnosis, and care once on the market, this panel is going to discuss how we can bring in efficiencies through collaboration and innovation. So with that, I think I will hand over to you, Veronica, to continue, and then I'll wrap up with some policy considerations, and then we'll move into the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just bring this. Okay, so I just wanted to reiterate a little bit of what Jeffrey already mentioned in terms of the need for collaboration to move forward, because no single individual and no single entity can do this on their own. And so what we need to do, and I think what happened here is the bullet points didn't quite line up, but I just wanted to mention just once the Forum for Collaborative Research, which is the organization I direct, which includes regulators from different countries, patients, industry, and academia, to find ways to collaborate amongst these sectors and have drug development be more efficient. So we need information democracy. All players need to have the same information available to them. We need to speak a common language, so defining what the disease is, defining endpoints, defining stages of disease is very important. We need to identify and resolve the hurdles. What we do also is foster openness and transparency. And one of our major activities right now is advancing non-invasive surrogate endpoints for accelerated approval. And you can read all the different activities here, like developing a consensus on what is most reasonably likely, and we're reviewing data, generate the data to fill the gaps, etc. We also want to help accelerate the confirmation of clinical endpoints, the clinical benefits, and collaborate. We have a database infrastructure where we receive data from industry studies that have been finished so that they can potentially become supplemental external controls, and work all the way on this, all the way to full approval of these drugs. Here I wanted to address a little bit the issue of the global regulatory systems. The jurisdiction of each authority, of course, is in their own region. And there are available global institutions like the International Council for Harmonization, but they work at a very high level. So when we're talking about disease-specific harmonization, it really depends on individual people from agencies to talk to each other and find ways to harmonize. And what we do at the forum is the informal harmonization, because they're all in the same room and can talk to each other. So important players in the systems is the European Medicines Agency, of course the FDA, and in Europe we don't have the CDRH system, which in the US approves diagnostics for marketing. This is for clinical care and approves them for marketing authorization. So that's a different system. And we have the African Medicines Agency, which covers the continent. It's in progress being set up. There's, of course, regulators in China, et cetera. And WHO, of course, plays a big role in addition to their policy standard setting in terms of pre-qualification and essential medicines list. So in terms of how we go from NITs then, from drug approval to clinical practice, so first of all, we do have a large body of data available through clinical studies, which can really serve to inform us how best to use the NITs in different patient populations. But in the US, if we want a biomarker to be approved for as a clinical trial endpoint, that is done through the Center for Drugs. If we want the biomarker approved for clinical care setting, then we have to clear that or approve it through the Center for Diagnostic and Radiation Health. And these systems are different across the globe. So this is an area where we all have to really learn what these processes are and work together with different regions of the world. And then, of course, also how the biomarkers are used in drug development, that's up to the regulatory authorities. But how they are used in clinical care, that's up to the clinical societies who write these guidelines. And of course, they will base it on data from the studies, the randomized clinical trials, as well as the clinical experience. Now, for diagnosing and treatment monitoring in clinical practice, how do we get to reimbursement? I know that's always a big question. And again, this is a US-centric view because I don't quite know how it works in Europe. But to get the approval, I guess this doesn't work, that red square there, what you really need to demonstrate is clinical utility, that if you order the test, get the result, it's going to change how you treat that patient. And so that's really important for the payers in the US, and I think I would guess everywhere else around the world. But we're not finished once we have a surrogate, a reasonably likely surrogate endpoint. This is supposed to illustrate that we have science and ideas, and then we filter those and figure out what's best for accelerated approval. More science keeps coming in, and we get to full approval, and then we get into clinical practice. But throughout this whole process, new science is coming in all the time, and hopefully at some point we will even be at the point where we can be much more precise in the patients and their needs and the medication and monitoring that they get. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Veronica. As I said, this is sort of a combo session, so I'll just take us back again to that policy level and the road to September 2025 when the UN General Assembly will be meeting, and right now really the liver health, liver disease is not on that agenda when the member states enter the room to take decisions on the final declaration. And our goal also with this meeting and in various activities, including the World Health Assembly side event that EASL, ASLD, and GLI held a couple weeks ago is to advocate to member states to include some language around liver health. I showed these key messages in the opening, so I won't go through them now, but there has been alignment on what the key messages are in the field around chronic liver disease, which is consensus language around the various liver diseases, so we can also be collaborating, with infectious diseases as well. I also presented the policy recommendations, but just to remind you, this is about recognizing chronic liver disease, including MASLD MASH, as a priority NCD. Yesterday it was mentioned the 4x4, then a fifth set of NCDs, mental health was added, but like with CKD, like with obesity, the liver health field is struggling to get this kind of high-level recognition. Again, we are trying to align with the NCD Alliance, as I showed, and specifically call on UN member states to take on these 3 issues. These short issues, it shouldn't add much cost. It actually should make things more effective because, as we heard, many of the best buys, the quick buys, the policies that are in place are going to be beneficial for liver disease. We just need to be able to name liver disease as well. These are the 5 NCDs in focus at the World Health Organization. And that means there's normative guidance, there's action plans, there's strategies. Best buys are developed and updated for them. And these 5 risk factors, as you can see, are largely the same risk factors that we're trying to address when we take an upstream approach. So we just think that it's nice to be able to say 4x4 and then 5x5, but we think we should say 6, 7, or even 8 by 5 and bring in other major highly prevalent NCDs into that kind of discussion. So where do we go from here? This requires effective policies. It requires effective regulatory frameworks, but recognizing steatotic liver disease as a major NCD would be a great starting point. As Veronica said, we have a lot of evidence, but we really need to accelerate our efforts. One group, even a few groups together, are not going to get this across the line. It needs to be patient groups aligned with other NGOs, aligned with professional societies, and ultimately we need friendly member states to take this forward through their missions in New York or in Geneva and get this language onto that kind of agenda. It also means expanding our community of practice, which is why it's nice to see so many people from different stripes, from different disciplines here at this meeting. So suddenly there's a liver meeting, but there's people from endocrinology, from cardiology, from primary care, diabetes, and other fields, public health, health systems joining us. So let me end on that and move us into our lead question and our discussion with the panel. The lead question is, the levers of change are policies, frameworks, and regulatory processes. Are they enabling or hindering progress on steatotic liver disease?
Great, thank you. So I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start at the other end, please.
I'm Gail Hinkson. I'm the CEO and co-founder for Summit Clinical Research in San Antonio, Texas.
I'm Luis Antonio Diaz. I'm a hepatologist, and I'm working at the UC San Diego in California.
Morten, Karsdal, head of R&D CEO Nordic Bioscience, love science.
And Carrie Hildick, Chief Strategy Officer at Perspective.
Yeah. Good. So, Carrie, would you talk about how can we improve and make these processes more efficient? And I know you're very much involved in, of course, the approval of your tests that you have, but so kind of improving not your own tests, but how do we get diagnostics into the market sooner generally, and then this whole policy level of how do we get the attention of the major policymakers.
I think in some ways, regulatory channels and policymakers have been helpful. It was great that when MASH drugs were first forming, they were requiring a mandate to look and include non-invasive testing alongside biopsy. I think it was awesome as well that the FDA came out with a strong statement last year saying they were encouraging not using biopsies in many contexts. However, I think there's still many challenges right now in moving those things effectively through up the full cascade, because as you say, each of those things is disconnected. Your clearance, your approval, your utility, your reimbursement, et cetera, they're all necessary, but none are sufficient on their own, and they're not always well connected in terms of kind of pulling through. How is this hindering steatotic liver disease? I feel like bringing everybody here together in this forum and having these different discussions is really important. But the nomenclature is not yet aligned. You said about consensus. I think it's so critical. If we can reach consensus, then we'll be able to elevate to a policy level. Because right now, there's individual clinics doing individual things. And it's very hard to raise that to the point where liver disease matters, because crayon simple statement, if there's a lot of disconnect there.
I mean, you're right, Carrie. We're a field that is very, very fragmented.
Yeah.
So we often say there's 5, big liver organizations, but that doesn't even include a MASLD, and that's all of India. So I mean, and China. So there's a lot of liver organizations, and in other fields we have, often a global organization in one way or another speaking for everyone. You heard, like when Michael Ninberg was here, the World Hepatitis Alliance with representatives from almost every country. And so that leads us to, not agree on the name of the disease, not agree on how we present it to the UN, and as you can see with the regulatory frameworks, it can get a little confusing, especially as drugs and maybe even diagnostics go into other countries. I wonder, Morten, if you want to comment on processes for us, how we can improve efficiencies. What's your view and take?
I was looking at the session 2 yesterday, and I've been sitting quietly and listening, because I don't think we should be diagnosing more MASH patients. I think we should be diagnosing the right patients, actually. And then we can debate who are those right patients. And of course, I would think that those are the ones that are actually progressing, because I'm not sure that we are getting the right attention if we're just saying that the disease is bigger than everybody else's. No, we need to be caring to those patients that have the largest risk of outcome. Otherwise, we will be diagnosing many patients that will have years with a disease that is actually it is asymptomatic, but we need to cater to them in the right way. And I think the reason why we've been misled a little by nomenclature, I love that nomenclature, is the best guidelines, right? So we are used to that a diagnostic test in the liver field is also a prognostic test. We are used to that the liver biopsy was actually chosen because it was the best prognostic test. We were also used to that in bone diseases, an image bone mineral density was both the best diagnostic and prognostic test. And we are used to in type 2 diabetes with the best biomarker in the world, HbA1c, that is truly a unicorn biomarker. It can do everything we want, diagnostic, prognostic, and efficacy of intervention. So I think some of the ways forward is asking the right question, making sure that we help the patients the best way, and also using the nomenclature, using the best guidelines, using the context of views in the best possible way. I think, and then I'm a little bit more positive than others on the guidelines that FDA have made out. I think actually the guidelines on reasonably likely surrogate endpoints are wonderful. They are worth a good read, and with Veronica leading some of those efforts, I think we are putting things together that can help this, but we need to make sure we're discussing the right context of use. Because just having a biomarker approved.
Right. And that whole discussion with regulators always does include the context of use.
Yeah.
But I think there are a lot of biomarkers. If you are diagnosed with lung cancer, that diagnosis itself will not give you the prognosis, right? You need to look at other factors. But if you're diagnosed with a certain amount of fibrosis or a certain amount of fat in your liver, because that's a dynamic biomarker, it can serve as prognostic and treatment response. So I think those are very true. But quickly, just 2 words. Is your assessment of the lead question, are the regulatory processes enabling or hindering? Where do you see that?
So I think we have had wonderful interactions with both agencies. I think FDA has been guiding reasonably well on different areas. My team has been lucky to have 3 letters of support. Last month we actually had a CE approval for diagnostic enrichment together with Roche. I think the matter of the fact is, and I think that's exactly where you're coming from, using the right vocabulary and saying the same thing in a big group of people.
Right.
Because if we say the right thing in a bigger group of people, then I think the guidelines are there to move us ahead. So the most important thing is the alignment in consortia such as this, so we continue to use a common, correct vocabulary and focus on smaller parts that we can move forward together.
Great, thank you. We should move up now to some of the more broader policy questions. Do you want to take that up?
Yep. Yeah, let me start. Well, Luis, many people who read Journal of Hepatology will know the great work you've been doing looking at policies around the world, including on alcohol, but also on MASLD. I mean, where are we at in terms of the policies in countries? I mean, I've already said, you know, it's easy globally, we're at ground zero, but are any countries doing better than others? What can you tell us about sort of the policy landscape in that, you know, large scan you did last year?
Thank you. Yeah, it's true. It's a very wide field to discuss, and probably we'll need several days to wrap up multiple conclusions. But the most important thing is that policies need to address steatotic liver disease as a continuum, from people with a lot of cardiometabolic risk factors to the opposite side, to people with heavy drinking and maybe just a few cardiometabolic risk factors. So when we do ecological studies assessing the impact, or at least the association of public health policies on alcohol, on diabetes, or even in healthy diets, we observe that a decrease in the burden of liver disease, not only alcohol-associated liver disease, also MASLD and the overall mortality for cirrhosis. So policies in general terms have a strong impact in the incidence and mortality of liver disease, regardless the cause that we are assessing. That's because obesity can impact hepatitis C, alcohol as well. Alcohol can induce new cases of hepatitis B and C. So it needs to be very comprehensive from my perspective when we settle policies from a government perspective. So people with steatotic liver disease will benefit a lot from policies from the alcohol field, for sure. And if we need to identify in the alcohol field, probably the best advice, including taxation, including the early identification of people struggling with the more severe consequences, and for sure to have a national plan showing the commitment of government to afford that problem. I think that's the most important from the alcohol side. And from the cardiometabolic side, we have less information, and probably policies like those increasing taxation of sugar, sweetened beverage, and labeling policies and other policies can impact strongly in the leading risk factors for liver disease, like obesity and diabetes. In fact, the taxation of sugar, sweetened beverage increases around 80% of the entire price for the customer. So that rise will be transferred for the customers and can decrease the drinking of those beverages, and also the development of metabolic consequences between 15 to 30%. So we need comprehensive public health policies, and also non-communicable diseases frameworks can be very beneficial for steatotic liver disease.
So you said in NCD frameworks, often in a particular condition, you want a strategy for your disease. So HIV, viral hepatitis, different cancers. So if you could pick, would you rather have a steatotic liver disease strategy in a country, or would you rather see steatotic liver disease sort of mainstreamed across other existing strategies?
That's a good point. I think steatotic liver disease needs to be highlighted as a relevant consequences of cardiometabolic risk factors. And that allows us to have a budget to do screening for liver fibrosis, not only the cardiometabolic risk factors. That can help us to provide more treatments for those patients and prioritize them, especially those at higher risk of liver-related mortality, to have access to all what they need in the same way that people with diabetes access to more advanced therapies, or people with obesity can access to pharmacological therapies, surgeries, or whatever they need. So I think that's the key, for sure. It's good to have policies on diabetes, on obesity, because we'll benefit people with steatotic liver disease, but we need to do a lot of things in other.
Can I jump in on that? Because I think that was exactly the question that I was wrestling with in preparation for this panel and some of the dialogues I've had today. I don't know the answer, but I think it's fundamental for us to think about what is the win for a mention in the NCD by September 2025, if it's not even got on the radar in the first draft. Is the win in September a standalone statement about steatotic liver disease? And if so, do we have clear nomenclature, a clear understanding of the global burden, a clear understanding of which outcome we're articulating? Or is it a stepping stone where this year we win by inserting ourselves into as many of the other existing non-communicable diseases to go, hey, you need to worry about steatotic liver disease under cardiovascular, under diabetes? It's a fundamental question, and I don't know that we'll solve it in the next 15 minutes.
That's looking like
but in September,
the best case scenario.
Yeah.
And remember, the high-level meeting won't meet and discuss NCDs for 3, 4, or 5 years again. There's other opportunities and other things that can be done. But that meeting happens every 3 or 4 years.
And my question to you is, Jeff, because I'm not from a policy background, how much of this how cost is the die already 2 or 3 years ago for us to get steatotic liver disease on the agenda now? Is this a wildly ambitious goal, or can things move that quickly in policy such that it is achievable?
In 2 or 3 years, it's definitely achievable. In 2 or 3 months, it's essentially impossible. So, we started over 2 years ago, and we haven't made great progress, but I'm looking already ahead. But Gail, we haven't really heard from you, and I know.
Yeah, so good to have you here, Gail. And from your perspective, how can payers and health systems enable earlier screening and equitable access to emerging MASLD treatments? And I will have a follow-up question that reflects back on something Morten said a little while ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we've heard over and over throughout this time here is that there needs to be alignment between care providers, there needs to be collaboration between departments, there needs to be education for the medical community and for the patients, and all of that is necessitated by, the realization that this is a growing, health crisis, if you will, and so from my perspective, the thing that we're not talking about a lot is continued research. We're definitely still in an era of additional evidence generation need, likely for phenotype definition for those that are most at risk, for NITs, certainly for new emerging therapies. And so in the absence of that alignment and all of those things, research really has a construct for those elements. We're actively engaging in communities and talking about the disease state. We're working with other departments to identify patients who could be potentially participants in research. And so I fully acknowledge that the phenotype for a patient getting into clinical trial is not necessarily the one that you would want to use for clinical care, but there is a roadmap that can be leveraged from continued research, and I think it's essential that there is a continued solidarity around participation in research, support for research within the institutions, and all of that helps build policy in the future.
Great. So the follow-up question is, in your question here, we raised the word screening,
Yeah,
which is different from diagnosis.
Yeah.
Now, Morten said we shouldn't be diagnosing more patients, we should diagnose the right patients.
right.
How do you see the screening efforts relate to that? And
Yeah.
what can we do if we do diagnose somebody who may not be at immediate risk of progression, but what are some of the interventions
Yeah.
that can be applied?
Yeah, I think all of that goes back to research for me as well. So very much what we do in research is targeting those patients, screen them, if you will, that are at risk, those that are F2, F3, or F4, depending on the clinical trial, so they're more advanced in their disease state, and target them based on non-invasives, perhaps biopsy, depending on the clinical trial, and other requirements of that protocol. So very much screening to find those that are at risk, but not ignoring those that are not at risk yet. Those are still in potential progression. And I think there's opportunities in research for all of those patients. I think research should be considered, participation in clinical trials should be considered as a part of the continuum of care that an institution has or that a clinician has access to for their patients.
Great. And maybe quickly back to you, Morten, then, how do you differentiate screening? And we're not talking about screening for a clinical trial.
Of course.
We're talking about screening populations and diagnosing patients. How would you differentiate that?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. And actually, Maya talked a little bit about it in her session. And we can ask the question differently. There are these two big consortiums that have been looking at NITs for liver. One is NIMBLE in the US, and another one has been Litmus. And sometimes the data do not look like, they do not really, there's no concordance. And how come you have two consortiums that doesn't show the same thing? Well, it's because the Litmus consortium is, as Maya said, a consortium where you have the prevalence that is in the general population. And the NIMBLE consortium has been constructed to have 20, 20, 20, so 20% healthy and then 20% different stages. And that's, of course, really affecting the tools that we have that's going to fire the ones. So without being too technically, then, and credit to Maya, smarter than I am on this, really understanding that in a patient population, we may need different tools for the screening part, and later for the ones that actually have active, ongoing, progressing disease.
Right.
And then just so being LIVERAIM, and I love LIVERAIM, I think it's also, in this period, we've been saying diagnosis for so long, and we thought we should be comparing it to the liver biopsy. Incorrect. We should be talking about the P. We should be talking about the prognostic abilities of these things. And I think it's 100,000 patients you're going to enroll, right, Maya?
Yep.
And of course, Jeff is everybody is part of this. And I think from that part, we're also going to get additional questions answered, because in the patient population, there are going to be cardiometabolic cases, there are going to be kidney cases, there are going to be liver cases. So which ones are the most important ones to have prognostic biomarkers for? I think LIVERAIM is going to
what prognosis as well, because I think there's a weird, if we're talking about, hindering or helping, there's a very rigid criteria right now around a liver drug needing to show a liver benefit and linked to liver outcomes, whereas some of these drugs have multi-system benefits that aren't necessarily being acknowledged in labels as they get cleared and pulled through. And you've got equally diagnostic biomarkers that can show outcomes and prognosis, not just for liver, but also for cardiovascular. But there seems to be, perhaps incorrect, too much focusing and siloing. If you're talking about, I think you're right, it should be on prognosis, and it should no longer be anchoring to biopsy. And I think the field is in agreement in that from the liver disease sense. But for prognosis, I think we need to answer, are we just looking at liver outcomes here, or are we actually looking at heart outcomes for patients, which shouldn't just be limited to liver?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think, there's a whole series of meetings on the question about what liver outcomes should you include in cardiovascular trials, as you well know. But unfortunately, I think the way this, the system is siloed. The liver is a very collaborative organ. the different divisions at the FDA are not necessarily, right? You have cardiovascular.
Someone said liver is silent, but it travels together.
Yeah.
I really like that. Yeah.
But I do want to actually maybe just give you all a heads up, because a question just came to me about implementation research, and are we actually using the tools of implementation research when we look at what's happening outside of clinical trials? So I'll come back to that, but let's first go to some of the audience questions.
Yep.
And I know, Juan, you had a very, some specific insights into the translation into healthcare.
Yeah, many thanks for giving me the voice, and many thanks for such an amazing sessions in general. Since the beginning, everything just has been amazing. I'm Joan Silva. I'm a medical doctor, a family doctor, and also I am the medical director for the digital medical service from DKV Insurance. So, as a physician, as a member representative from one of the largest private insurance company in Spain, we have been thinking as healthcare providers, and we are wanting to structure a system of reimbursement of DHIs here in Spain. Exactly. So with that, we can do the continuous follow-up and tackle different conditions, including, of course, NCDs management. So talking about these procedures, we don't have determined policies or frameworks for some associations right now, like ORCA in England, that they validate some DHIs and they put it on the hand of the doctor to be prescribed. And also in Germany, the DIGA, that they also did the same, and they validate such DHIs. So the main question is, which path should we take to start this from the health insurance perspective?
I think health insurance companies plays a central role here, especially in countries where you can find a mixed system or a private system predominantly. In terms of identification of the populations, I think if there are settings demonstrating a decrease in the overall cost of the health system, I think that's fair to start screening as the companies used to do it. For example, looking for diabetes or looking for cardiovascular disease over 50 years old. It depends of each scenario. But I think the most important thing are two main aspects. The first one, it's the cost effectiveness of that screening in the overall population. And the second one, what will you offer to that patient? Because if you identify a silent disease that can probably will not affect him in the following 10 years, for example, someone with a low risk, but you're increasing awareness or you're forcing to take additional steps with their disease, I think that's a problem. So probably it's important to define and be sure that you are looking for the right people at higher risk, and we will benefit most for that screening process, and not only trying to just decrease the overall cost. So,
I mean, you raise a really good point, and I agree, of course, with Morten on consensus. But in every consensus study we've done, we've also reported the level of disagreement, and it's rare we come to the 100% consensus, unanimous. And so, we already talked about this a little earlier, and so I don't know if we want to get into that debate, but, when a person with a condition that can potentially progress, because right now we can't identify if, exactly if they're going to progress. We can talk about sometimes, greater likelihood, but we don't know, if it's 100% sure. Who decides if that person should know they have that condition or not? And I'll give you an example, and I mean, it's an infectious disease, but back when Veronica and I were working in HIV, there was a big debate that in countries where antiretroviral therapy wasn't available, we shouldn't have screening programs. Obviously, from WHO, we were arguing, well, it's a transmissible disease, so there's many other, and it's preventable, but there was the argument that if we can't treat it, we don't test for it. So where are we now? I mean, we have, patient, advocates in the audience. I mean, who decides? This is going to be a consensus where we have to ask people living with the condition, people at risk of the condition. We need to explain to them that what we can do and what we can't do, and then we need to speak to the medical specialists. This is a big consensus process,
And I
Morten.
think depending on where they are in that disease process, are you looking at managing a late stage of disease progression, and you're managing, and trying to remove a risk and progression to cirrhosis? Are you looking at actually primary prevention in a modifiable risk factor for another condition like cardiovascular disease? Or are you looking at secondary prevention in diabetes management? And again, I've just opened up 3 different ways.
And they in turn can be advocates for the communities that they serve, that they represent. And I think that's an important element in this as well, is identifying, and having very conscious, advocacy for the communities that are perhaps underrepresented in the information and the data that we have now.
Right, so I think, Morten, you were saying that MASLD is not like an infectious disease or like HIV, but, it may not be transmissible, but I do think it travels within families and communities, and communities that are tightly knit, where people eat together. In many places these days, people don't really eat together with other people very much, but there's still a lot of places where people do eat together as families, and the shopping is done for the family. So I think there is that sort of not direct, my fatty liver cells are being transposed to you, but there is that sense of traveling together as a community. So I think there again, maybe much more could be done.
My question really is how to get the patient voice into the policy discussion. And I think the idea that we're going to part diagnose you and not completely diagnose you and risk stratify, I don't think sits very well with the patients. We've got some knowledge about your health. We have got incomplete knowledge about your future trajectory. We should be sharing that, in my view, rather than saying, okay, we're not going to diagnose you because we think you're in a lower risk group for progression. That's my personal view, but how do we get the patient voice in to kind of resolve that dichotomy?
Yeah, well, there are patient advocates who can certainly answer in the room. I mean, I'll start, and I don't know, Michael, Mike, Nikos, Rogerio, others. I mean, the patient, there's the patients, there's the patient advocates, there's the patient advocacy groups, and so they do need a certain degree of legitimacy. We can learn a lot, from HIV, where they got their voice by taking to the streets. Hopefully that doesn't need to be done again, but that periodically is what happens. But I mean, supporting patient advocacy groups to engage everywhere from FDA decisions to engaging with the professional societies. I think the professional societies have a responsibility to help engage with, in our case, liver groups, but actually now I would say also diabetes groups and cancer groups and others. And there was a time at some of our conferences, including at EASL, where the patient voice was outside and would have meetings separate and wouldn't attend the conference. So professional societies play a role, patient groups being inclusive and engaging strategically, working hand in hand across disease areas, I think will make a big difference. I don't know, Michael, if you want to add, and I know Nikos is here somewhere. There's
Mike,
there you are, Nikos. Oh, there you are, Nikos.
We need.
And then we'll get a mic up to the front for Michael.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, I was thinking that when it comes to how to become more involved, obviously the hepatitis groups were the first who have been involved. But the more we want to have greater awareness, and we speak that we want to approach the diabetes field, or the cardiovascular, or the metabolic syndrome interested scientific societies and patient organizations. So one of the propositions, and perhaps we can discuss it in the next panel that I have, is that to engage more actively with umbrella organizations, exactly because we all, as potential patients, have an interest to make sure that this is tackled in a holistic manner. So that's the first response.
Yeah, and I'll add, because Nikos is very modest, but I mean, as you're vice chair of the European AIDS Treatment Group, and earlier was, many years ago was chair. And when Nikos was chair of the EATG, they were the first, civil society organization that WHO Europe made a memorandum of understanding with. And I think that was back in 2005 or 6. So you had an official relationship with WHO. You went on to, lead the patient groups across all therapeutic areas for Greece. You've been a patient group member of the European Public Patients Forum. And so it's taking that experience and cross-pollinating also to other groups that can use your supports. We had a mic.
Maya
There,
has
Maya.
been waiting patiently, yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you, Morten, for the kind words. And then I just wanted to take the opportunity to elaborate a little bit on the 100,000 and the LIVERAIM, because I think we are discussing regulatory barriers, and we are discussing a lot screening, both today and yesterday. And so what we will do in LIVERAIM, we will randomize 100,000 people from the general population to a screening or no screening for placing them at risk or giving them a risk score for future liver disease. And those who screen positive will be provided intervention to reduce this score. What we will do, and I think this is what makes me most proud of that project, is we will follow up everyone randomized, both the control and the intervention group, for 10 years, looking at outcomes. So eventually, in 10 years, we will know whether screening linked to care actually translates into reduced liver-related outcomes and reduced liver-related mortality. And I think from a regulatory standpoint, this will be the key factor, because for regulators, they will look at, of course, cost and effectiveness, but most important for them is if you want an intervention, you need to prove that it reduces morbidity and mortality. So we have, with the design of the positive trial, which we call it, we have been very inspired by cancer screening programs, because this is exactly what you need to show for a cancer screening program to go national, is reduced organ-specific or cancer-specific mortality, in this case, liver-related mortality.
Can I go? So just to start with Jeff's, with what Jeff said, there's been a lot more streams at all the major conferences, the Forum for Collaborative Research, also Mosaic, this one, where patients absolutely have a voice and a place at the table, at the panels, and even presenting at some of them. So we have that opportunity to do that. I think all of us want to have a voice. If you the stats, you look at this room, so you have to apply the same thing. About 38% of people in this room have fatty liver also. So all of us are patients, or our families are patients, and so we have to think about ourselves not just as physicians or clinicians, but also as patients. So, all of us have a need to be heard and a need to express ourselves. So just to think about that a little bit. But with the Forum for Collaborative Research, I just want to call out that we developed our own group, PEDAL. I'll never remember the acronym, but I'll try anyway. Patients Engaged in Drug Design and Leading Through Example. I did, yeah, that's right. I never get that right. Anyway, and we're working together, and this is a cross collaboration with industry, clinicians, patients, and so that's a great example, I think, where we can set the bar.
Great, thank you. So I think one in the back, and then
I wanted to allude to what you mentioned in framing the session around regulatory authorities, and you listed the number of them. Is very much, of course, a market that is still controlled by the North and FDA, AMA, but the burden shifting, as I mentioned earlier in my address,
in low and middle income countries. One aspect that we haven't really discussed is national regulatory authorities in low and middle income countries with the level of maturity that allow them to register drugs quicker, because one of the hurdle, and have been doing this with WHO for a decade in terms of market shaping for NCD medicine across the board. One of the challenges is that even when drugs have shown their efficacy, their registration have at most 1 decade of delay, even for drugs that we are using now for diabetes management. NRAs that have a level of maturity 3 or 4 as per the standard of WHO allow access sometimes to multiple countries in the region. And I think, I don't know what has been your experiences in engaging, and my suggestion also is if we do a next session, that more global perspective from those regions, including, in that aspect, national regulatory authority in sub-Saharan Africa, there are now Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Senegal, as per December, that have been reaching a level of 3 of NRA. This should be part of the discussion as well, because otherwise we will have, including, in those countries, disparities in access, not because the efficacy have not proven, because the registration of the drugs is not trickling down, and actually those countries are not having those drugs at the right time.
You're so right. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And I went over the slide very quickly, but we are developing relationships through the forum with several of the national authorities, and also working with Africa CDC, and of course the African Union is moving towards one kind of like the EMA system. But you're absolutely right. To do global health, to do public health, you need the drugs and diagnostics available in the countries. They need to be registered. And of course, WHO also plays a big role there in the essentials medicines list. And I don't know, do they do pre-qualification for NCDs? They certainly do that for TB, malaria, and HIV. But anyway, there's a lot of work across a lot of work needed for around the world on this. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah.
So thank you. Around the world, lots of territories will have well-man, well-women tests that include indices of metabolic health like hypertension and cholesterol. And we tell people those results even if they don't need treatment. And we suggest that they ought to change their lifestyle accordingly. And the bit that I really want to highlight, though, is that the patients who are likely to die of liver disease are the marginalized, and they are the ones who have unequal access to healthcare. And so, in fact, in liver disease is where we've got the greatest socioeconomic gradient. But there's this assumption that we don't want to have patients worry their pretty little heads about their liver abnormalities. And I really think, my question to you guys is, where is the outrage? Because this is a community who don't really have a political voice. It's not like they're middle-class white people who've got a political constituency. So I think our role is to persuasively articulate eloquently that outrage and make sure that we're not complicit in the stigma that compounds this. And really, if we call it out for what it is, I think that will get us further. So maybe, Jeff, we do need protests outside. And maybe that's really what we need to identify, is that there are people out who are going to die of liver disease, but they don't really have a voice.
Thank you very much. Francesco Branca, I actually wanted to ask Veronica to continue on that line she started on implementation research, because I do believe that an understanding of the implementation gaps of the existing guidelines on prevention and management is absolutely critical for the political process, because it would highlight what are the priorities of that political action. Political action has to focus on the gaps, not on everything. So where would you think are the real key elements, key areas that should be explored for those barriers and implementation gaps?
Wow, great, thank you so much. When you start a project, you think of what are the outcomes I'm looking for and how am I going to evaluate it. So when Mexico institute a tax on sugary drinks, how do you evaluate what the impact of that policy is? There need to be measurable outcomes for that. And I think too many programs get started with very good ideas, very good intentions, but lack of evaluation of what actually happens. And I think we lose a lot of momentum if we don't design these interventions correctly. So that's kind of where I'm going with this.
I think we should start to wrap up, because in the urban policies session, I mean, it's going to be co-chaired by Mina Bansal, and she's in New York City, and she's working on the MASH Cities initiative. It will also be co-chaired by Nikos Dedes, who has been working with fast-track cities for HIV to show how cities can really do something.
Quick wrap-up from Gail's. Should we do that?
Yeah,
Gail?
30 seconds each.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, just reiterating, I think in order to help influence policy, I think research should continue to be a focus. There should be commitment from the institutions and engaging patients for advocacy.
Great, thank you. Juan?
I think we need a preventive side, including deleting risk factors and probably identify those who will probably die or are closer to die to liver-related events. And don't forget to improve in the medical schools and nurses schools to train how to assess alcohol and other cardiometabolic risk factors, because we spend a lot of time and energy and money in non-invasive tests, but we can even prevent just asking about alcohol consumption and other things in clinical practice.
Great, thank you. Morten? 30 seconds.
Guidelines are there. We need unity and we need alignment to use them, and then prognosis is more important than diagnosis.
Absolutely. But, okay, good.
I'll build on
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
We need to think different, and we need to tell them why it matters. And we have to do it in only 30 seconds or less, otherwise they're not going to hear.
Thank you, panelists. That was fantastic. Thank you, Veronica. We are approaching our last session. I know some people need to stand up and stretch, but I think in 2 minutes we'll start, and we'll move into the urban policy session.